The rain hammered against the concrete walls of the military compound in Ouagadougou as Colonel Mamadou Sankara paced his dimly lit office. The sound of boots echoing through the corridors had become a constant reminder of the tension that gripped Burkina Faso's capital. It was October 2023, and the country had been under military rule for just over a year since Ibrahim Traoré's rise to power. But Sankara knew that power in West Africa was as fragile as morning mist. Sankara had served in the Burkinabé army for 23 years. He had witnessed 3 coups, survived 2 attempted assassinations, and had learned that loyalty in politics was a currency that could be devalued overnight. Tonight, however, felt different. Tonight, he was about to make a decision that would either elevate him to the highest office in the land or cost him his life. The phone on his desk buzzed. The caller ID showed only numbers, but Sankara recognized the sequence. It was his contact from the Regional Intelligence Network, a shadowy figure known only as Cobra. The voice that came through the encrypted line was distorted, mechanical, but the message was crystal clear. "The Americans are getting nervous," Cobra said without preamble. Traoré's recent statements about kicking out Western forces have reached Washington. They're looking for alternatives. Sankara felt his pulse quicken. For months, he had been positioning himself as that alternative. Unlike Traoré, who had embraced a more radical anti-Western stance, Sankara understood the delicate balance required to maintain power in the Sahel. He knew that complete independence was an illusion when your country depended on foreign aid and your military needed outside support to fight jihadist insurgents. "What's the timeline?" Sankara asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sooner than you think. Traoré is planning something big. Our sources suggest he's about to announce the expulsion of all French and American military advisors. When that happens, the international community will need someone they can work with." The line went dead, leaving Sankara alone with his thoughts and the sound of rain against his window. He walked to the window and looked out at the sprawling military base. Hundreds of soldiers were under his direct command, men who respected him not just for his rank but for his years of frontline experience fighting against jihadist groups in the northern regions. But replacing Traoré would not be a simple matter of military strength. The young captain had cultivated genuine popular support, especially among the youth who saw him as a symbol of African sovereignty. Any move against him would need to be swift, decisive, and backed by powerful allies. 3 days later, Sankara received an invitation that confirmed his suspicions. The French ambassador to Burkina Faso, Marie-Claire Dubois, requested a private meeting at a secure location outside the capital. Such meetings were not unusual, but the timing was significant. Intelligence reports suggested that Traoré was indeed preparing to announce the expulsion of foreign military personnel within the week. The meeting took place at a nondescript safe house on the outskirts of Ouagadougou. Ambassador Dubois was accompanied by a man who introduced himself only as Robert, claiming to represent regional security interests. Sankara quickly understood that Robert was likely CIA, though such details were never spoken aloud in these types of meetings. "Colonel Sankara," Ambassador Dubois began, her French accent lending gravity to her words, "we find ourselves at a crossroads. Captain Traoré's recent policies are destabilizing not just Burkina Faso, but the entire Sahel region. The security partnership that has kept jihadist groups at bay is under threat." Robert leaned forward, his American accent unmistakable despite his attempt to speak quietly. "We need someone who understands that fighting terrorism requires international cooperation. Someone who can lead this country without burning bridges with the international community. Sankara had expected this conversation, but hearing it spelled out so directly still sent a chill down his spine. What exactly are you proposing? We're not proposing anything, Dubois replied carefully. We're simply expressing our concern about the current trajectory and our hope that reasonable voices within the military will prevail. But the unspoken message was clear. They wanted Traoré removed, and they were offering their support to make it happen. The question was whether Sankara was willing to be their instrument. Over the following days, Sankara found himself caught between conflicting emotions. Part of him admired Traoré's courage in standing up to Western powers. The young captain's speeches about African sovereignty resonated with something deep in Sankara's own heart. He too had grown tired of seeing his country's resources exploited by foreign corporations while his people remained poor. But Sankara was also a pragmatist. He had seen what happened to leaders who moved too fast, who pushed too hard against established power structures. Thomas Sankara, the legendary Burkinabé leader from whom the colonel had taken his nom de guerre, had been assassinated in 1987 for similar reasons. History had a way of repeating itself in West Africa. The colonel began reaching out to other senior military officers, testing their loyalty to Traoré. What he discovered both encouraged and troubled him. Many officers shared his concerns about the current direction of the country. They worried that Traoré's radical policies would lead to economic isolation and leave Burkina Faso vulnerable to jihadist attacks. Major Boubacar Diallo, commander of the Presidential Guard, was particularly receptive to Sankara's subtle inquiries. During a private dinner at Sankara's residence, Diallo expressed his frustrations openly. Traoré is brilliant, I'll give him that, Diallo said, swirling his glass of whiskey. But brilliance without wisdom is dangerous. He's moving too fast, making too many enemies. The French have been our partners for decades, whatever their faults. Cutting them off completely is suicide. Sankara nodded thoughtfully. What if there were an alternative? Someone who could maintain our sovereignty while being more diplomatic about how we achieve it. Diallo's eyes met Sankara's across the table. I would support such a person, if they had the backing to succeed. Similar conversations took place over the following weeks. Sankara carefully built a network of officers who were growing increasingly uncomfortable with Traoré's direction. He was meticulous in his approach, never directly advocating for a coup but always positioning himself as a reasonable alternative. But that was only the beginning of his problems. The first sign that his activities had been detected came on a humid Tuesday morning. Captain Abdoulaye Kabore, one of Traoré's most trusted aides, requested a meeting with Sankara. The younger officer's demeanor was respectful but cautious as they sat in Sankara's office. Colonel, I've been hearing rumors, Kabore began. Rumors about meetings, about conversations that some might interpret as problematic. Sankara felt his blood pressure rise but maintained his composure. I meet with many people, Captain. It's part of my responsibilities to maintain relationships within the military. Of course, sir. But Captain Traoré wanted me to remind you that unity within the military is essential, especially during these challenging times. The message was clear, they were watching him. Sankara realized that his activities had been more visible than he had hoped. Either someone in his network had talked, or Traoré's intelligence apparatus was more sophisticated than he had given them credit for. That evening, Sankara made a secure call to Cobra. The response was immediate and alarming. You need to move faster, the distorted voice said. Our sources indicate that Traoré is planning a purge. He's identified several officers as potential threats. Your name is on that list. Sankara's mouth went dry. How long do I have? Days, maybe less. If you're going to act, it has to be now. The colonel spent a sleepless night weighing his options. He could abort his plans, try to convince Traoré of his loyalty, and hope to survive any purge. But he knew that once suspicion fell on an officer in a military government, survival was rarely guaranteed. The alternative was to accelerate his timeline and move against Traoré before Traoré could move against him. By dawn, Sankara had made his decision. He activated his network of loyal officers, calling an emergency meeting for that afternoon. The gathering took place at a secure facility outside the capital, away from potential surveillance. 12 senior officers attended, representing various branches of the military and different units throughout the country. "Gentlemen," Sankara began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to propose, "we face a critical moment in our nation's history. Captain Traoré's policies are leading us toward isolation and potential collapse. Worse, intelligence suggests he is planning to remove officers he views as threats to his authority." A murmur went through the room. Major Diallo leaned forward. "What are you proposing, Colonel?" "I'm proposing that we act to save our country and ourselves. Traoré must be removed, and new leadership must be established before Burkina Faso descends into chaos." The room fell silent. Finally, Lieutenant Colonel Ousmane Compaoré, the oldest officer present, spoke up. "This is not a decision to make lightly. Traoré has popular support. Any action against him could trigger civil unrest. Which is why we must act decisively and quickly," Sankara replied. "We control key military units. We have international backing. If we move swiftly, we can present the changes necessary for national stability." The debate that followed was intense but brief. These were men who understood that in military politics, hesitation was often fatal. By evening, they had agreed to move against Traoré within 48 hours. But no one expected what came next. The following morning, as Sankara was finalizing plans for the coup, he received an urgent call from Major Diallo. The man's voice was strained, barely controlled. "Colonel, we have a problem. Captain Traoré was found dead in his apartment this morning. Shot twice in the head." Sankara felt the world shift beneath his feet. Traoré had been the one to warn him about the rumors, Traoré's most trusted aide. His death could mean several things, none of them good. "Any leads on who did it?" Sankara asked. "That's the problem, sir. The preliminary investigation suggests it was a professional hit. But here's what's really disturbing. Traoré's phone records show he made several calls to unknown numbers in the hours before his death. Numbers that trace back to foreign intelligence services." The implications hit Sankara like a physical blow. Either Traoré had been working with foreign agents, or someone wanted it to appear that way. Either scenario suggested that the situation was far more complex than he had realized. Within hours, rumors began spreading through the military that Traoré had been killed because he had discovered a foreign plot against the government. Traoré appeared on national television that evening, his youthful face grave as he addressed the nation. "My fellow citizens," Traoré began, "today we lost a patriot, a soldier who died defending our sovereignty. Captain Traoré had uncovered evidence of foreign interference in our internal affairs. He was killed to silence him." Sankara watched the broadcast from his office, his blood running cold as Traoré continued. We have discovered that certain elements within our own military have been in contact with foreign agents. These traitors sought to undermine our government and return our country to foreign domination. But their plot has been exposed. The camera zoomed in on Traoré's face as he delivered his final words. Effective immediately, a special tribunal will be established to investigate this conspiracy. Those found guilty of treason will face the full consequences of their actions. Sankara knew his time had run out. Within hours, security forces would be moving to arrest him and the other officers involved in the plot. His only chance was to accelerate the coup timeline and move that very night. He made desperate calls to his network, but the responses were devastating. 3 of the key officers had already been arrested. 2 others had fled the country. Major Diallo's phone went straight to voicemail. As night fell over Ouagadougou, Sankara realized that his carefully constructed plan was falling apart. Worse, he was beginning to suspect that the entire operation had been compromised from the beginning. The timing of Kabore's death, the speed with which Traoré had responded, the precision with which key officers were being neutralized, it all suggested that someone had been feeding information to Traoré's camp. The colonel sat in his darkened office, considering his limited options. He could surrender and hope for mercy, though he knew that military tribunals in West Africa rarely showed leniency to coup plotters. He could attempt to flee the country, but his movements were likely being monitored. Or he could make one final desperate attempt to salvage the operation. His secure phone buzzed. It was Cobra. "The situation has changed," the mechanically distorted voice said. "Our support has been withdrawn. You're on your own." "What do you mean?" Sankara demanded. "Kabore's death has complicated things. Too much attention, too much risk. Find your own way out." The line went dead, and Sankara realized he had been abandoned by his foreign backers. They had been willing to support him when success seemed likely, but now that the operation was compromised, they were cutting their losses. But Sankara was not ready to give up. He still had one card to play. Lieutenant Colonel Compaoré had been skeptical of the coup from the beginning, but he commanded the armored division stationed just outside the capital. If Sankara could reach him and convince him to act, they might still have a chance. Sankara gathered his personal weapons and what cash he had in his safe. He knew that once he left his office, he would be a fugitive. But he also knew that sitting still meant certain capture. The drive to Compaoré's base was the longest 30 minutes of Sankara's life. He expected to be stopped at every checkpoint, arrested at every turn. But somehow, he made it to the armored division's compound without incident. Compaoré was waiting for him, and his expression was grim. "Mamadou, what have you done?" the older officer asked as they met in private. "What I had to do," Sankara replied. "What we all should have done months ago. It's over. Traoré knows everything. Half the officers involved have been arrested, the others have fled. You need to surrender before this gets worse." "I won't surrender to become a show trial for Traoré's regime," Sankara said firmly. "I still have loyal men. We can still act." Compaoré shook his head sadly. "Look around you, Mamadou. Do you see any loyal men here? Do you see anyone willing to die for your ambitions?" It was then that Sankara noticed the armed soldiers positioned around the building. They weren't there to protect him, they were there to arrest him. "I'm sorry, old friend," Compaoré said quietly. "But I have to think about my own men, my own family." Traoré offered amnesty to anyone who cooperates. "I can't throw that away for a lost cause." The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Sankara had built his career on understanding loyalty, on knowing who could be trusted. But in the end, he had misjudged everyone, his allies, his enemies, and most critically, himself. As the soldiers moved to arrest him, Sankara's mind raced through the events of the past weeks. He realized now that the coup had been doomed from the start. Traoré was not the naive young officer that Sankara had assumed him to be. The captain had played a more sophisticated game, allowing the conspiracy to develop just enough to identify all the participants before crushing it completely. The arrest was handled professionally, without unnecessary violence. Sankara was transported back to the capital in an armored vehicle, his hands bound but his head held high. As they drove through the streets of Ouagadougou, he could see that the city was calm. There were no signs of the civil unrest that some had predicted would follow a coup attempt. The trial that followed was swift and, by the standards of military justice, fair. Sankara was allowed legal representation and the opportunity to present his defense. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Phone records, meeting logs, financial transactions, Traoré's intelligence apparatus had documented every aspect of the conspiracy. Standing before the military tribunal, Sankara found himself oddly at peace. He had taken his shot at power and failed. In the brutal calculus of African politics, that meant his time was over. Colonel Sankara, the presiding judge announced, "You have been found guilty of conspiracy against the state, collaboration with foreign agents, and treason. However, in recognition of your years of service to the nation and your cooperation during this investigation, this tribunal sentences you to life imprisonment rather than death." As he was led away to begin his sentence, Sankara caught sight of Ibrahim Traoré in the courtroom gallery. The young captain nodded slightly, a gesture that might have been respect or simply acknowledgement of a worthy opponent defeated. In the months that followed, as Sankara adjusted to life in military prison, he had time to reflect on the events that had led to his downfall. He realized that he had never truly understood Traoré or the forces that had brought him to power. The captain's anti-Western rhetoric had been genuine, but it had also been strategic. By positioning himself as the defender of African sovereignty, Traoré had made it almost impossible for his opponents to challenge him without appearing to be foreign puppets. The international community, meanwhile, had learned to adapt to Traoré's leadership style. Rather than supporting coups against him, they had begun working within the framework he had established. It was a more complex relationship than the simple client-patron dynamics of the past, but it was ultimately more sustainable. Sankara's fellow prisoners included several other officers who had been involved in various plots against the government. From them, he learned that his had not been the only attempt to remove Traoré. There had been at least 3 other conspiracies that he was aware of, all of them detected and neutralized before they could gain momentum. The most disturbing revelation came from Major Diallo, who had been arrested the same night as Sankara. During one of their whispered conversations in the prison yard, Diallo revealed that he had been feeding information to Traoré's intelligence service throughout the conspiracy. "I never wanted to betray you, Mamadou," Diallo said, his voice heavy with guilt. "But they had evidence of my financial irregularities. They gave me a choice: cooperate or face court-martial for corruption." Sankara felt a mix of anger and pity for his former ally. In the end, they had all been playing a game whose rules they hadn't fully understood. Traoré had outmaneuvered them not through superior force, but through superior intelligence and political acumen. Years passed in the military prison. Sankara watched through smuggled newspapers and radio broadcasts as Burkina Faso navigated the complex challenges of the Sahel region. Traoré's government survived several attempted coups, economic crises, and international pressure. The young captain, now a general, had proven to be a more durable leader than many of his critics had expected. Sometimes, Sankara wondered what might have happened if he had chosen differently. If he had remained loyal to Traoré, he might have played a role in shaping the country's future. If he had fled when he first sensed danger, he might have lived in comfortable exile. If he had acted more decisively when he first began planning the coup, he might have succeeded. But these were the thoughts of a man with too much time and too few options. The reality was that he had gambled everything on one throw of the dice and lost. In the unforgiving arena of West African politics, there were rarely second chances. As the sun set over the prison compound on another day, Sankara reflected on the irony of his situation. He had sought to replace Traoré to bring stability to Burkina Faso, but his failure had probably contributed to that stability. By demonstrating the consequences of disloyalty, his defeat had strengthened Traoré's position and discouraged other potential challengers. In the end, Colonel Mamadou Sankara had become an object lesson in the dangers of ambition without adequate preparation. His story would be whispered in military academies and officers' clubs across West Africa as a cautionary tale about the price of failed coups. The man who had dreamed of leading his nation would spend the rest of his life as a reminder of what happened to those who reached too high, too fast, without understanding the true nature of the power they sought to grasp. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe to FictionWire Africa. This is a fictional story created purely for entertainment.